Hey everyone, it's Lexie. So in today's video, I'll be doing a video that was inspired by one that Sam did on thoughts on tomes, and it essentially is fantasy for historical fiction fans. And I thought this one was pretty good because originally I started out, before BookTube, I started out being mainly just historical fiction and crime thrillers, and so it took me a while to get into fantasy, but there was some novels that really stood out for me that kind of helped fill the void of me kind of getting into fantasy, and also kind of helped draw me in with some historical feel to it. So these were ones that really stood out to me, to having that historical fiction feel to them, whether it is the setting or era that they take place in. So yeah, without further ado, let's get started. So starting out, I first had the Gemma Doyle trilogy by Libba Bray, and I read this in high school and I honestly loved it. Besides Harry Potter, I didn't read a lot of fantasy, and this was like the only one that I read at the time, and I really liked it. Like, it takes place in a Victorian England setting, and anything else surrounding this I don't really remember too much because I read it so long ago. But essentially the premise of this, we follow Gemma, who ends up losing her mother in this tragic accident, and so she ends up getting shipped over to this boarding school, and she ends up kind of discovering that she has this paranormal gift, and it kind of goes off from there. But essentially what I really like about this one is the Victorian setting. Like, it's so atmospheric in terms of the boarding school and just their outfits and just the whole feel of like the cobblestone streets and the street lights or street lamps and all that stuff. Like, it was a lot of fun, and this is definitely one I want to reread again because it's been so long. I was totally obsessed with this series. It was so good. So if you like kind of Victorian era kind of historical fiction, then I think this would be a good introduction into fantasy. So this one is kind of like a play on historical fiction because right now during the pandemic we're kind of living through a major historical event, so I thought this one kind of played off of that. And it is the Year One Trilogy by Nora Roberts. So this isn't really something that I would necessarily pick up by myself, but my aunt got me this for my birthday a couple years ago, and I honestly was blown away. But it incorporates kind of some of her magic system into this. So essentially it takes place in modern day, and there is this virus, that outbreak that takes over the world, and essentially 2/3 of the world's population are killed within the first week, and those who are immune to this kind of virus are those who have some sort of magical ability to them. So you can see how that can cause some kind of anarchy and discontent between the different groups. And so this one is kind of eerily similar to the COVID pandemic in terms of not necessarily the magical aspect in here, but just kind of that feeling that everyone had in the beginning of the pandemic, where everyone was like literally scared, like, what do we do? And that initial fear is really much reminiscent of what is in here. And I really like this one. Like I said, it's not necessarily something that I would pick up, but I was actually totally engrossed in this story because I feel like although this is a fantastical take on a pandemic, it's very much eerily similar to what we experience. So yeah, this one, like I said, exceeded all expectations, and this is honestly one of my favorite trilogies of all time. So next up, so if you kind of like the era of the gold rush, going out west, kind of trying to find gold, like that type of era in like the 1800s, then I would recommend the Gold Seer trilogy by Carson. And I think this one is a good introduction into fantasy as well, because there is some fantastical elements into it, but it's very much rooted in this time period and kind of the gold rush era. So it follows this girl who has this ability to sense gold in the ground, and you can see how that would be a very useful asset during this time, and being able to sense where gold is. And so that causes a lot of problems for people who know about this ability. So she ends up going on the run, and kind of after her parents are murdered, she ends up fleeing out west to go to California, and it kind of takes off from there. So like I said, this one isn't like a high fantasy, it is a historical fiction with fantasy and magical elements woven into it. So I think it is very much a kind of good introduction into fantasy. I find, like, especially for me when I was starting out, the things that are so complex and obscure are really hard to grasp, but because this one has a historical setting to it and it's very much it's very much rooted in this historical time period, it's much easier to get through. And this is a fun trilogy. I read it a long time ago, but it was still a lot of fun, and this cover is just gorgeous. So if you are a fan of the 1920s and like the Roaring 20s, then this is the series for you, and it is the Diviner series by Libba Bray, and this is a well-loved series here on BookTube, but I think it is a well-deserved one as well. So this follows people that are known as diviners, who are people that can have some sort of paranormal gift to them. So one person can touch an object and know the history of that object and who it belonged to. One person can walk through dreams, those type of things, but the main kind of focus of this is the 1920s era and kind of being totally engrossed in New York during this time. There's prohibition, there is all these other things, there's flappers, like that total 1920s atmosphere, just the setting and just what made it called the Roaring 20s. You get totally immersed in this time period, but this author does a really good job of not shying away from the darker sides of history during this time, particularly racism, the eugenics movement, all those things that are still very relevant today. And I like how she was able to draw parallels to a lot of the especially the racist kind of ideologies that are still very much present today, and how they've kind of gained momentum again because of the Trump presidency. So I think this one is very interesting as well, because even though this is rooted basically 100 years ago, there's still a lot of important themes and elements that are very much relevant today. And I think also like the 1920s settings in here just makes it extra like regal, and also this series is actually quite spooky. I will give you that. It is really spooky. Like, I read this a long time ago, and it was during the summer, and I was up and reading at nighttime, and I'm like, this is so spooky, because I'm like, my bedroom's on the main floor, like someone literally, like, it just made me extra like paranoid. So if you kind of like that kind of spooky read in the 1920 eras, then I think you will like this series as well. And lastly, I have the Winternight trilogy by Katherine Arden, and this one is very much based on Russian folklore, and I will write here the actual like time period it's loosely based on, because I can't like pinpoint when exactly it is, but it's honestly, this is such a atmospheric read to it. I think especially because it's based on folklore that is kind of passed down throughout Russian history, it also makes it very interesting as well. For this one here, we follow a girl who we kind of follow her for most of her life, but she has this ability to see the actual folk creatures that are kind of based around her, and this kind of very much shows the struggle between kind of religion and then kind of these folklore tales, and how religion, the implementation of religion, is getting rid of these characters in these stories as people are kind of transitioning into kind of a god type being, and as opposed to kind of just like the creatures of of the horses, or like these things here that they created. So I think this one shows, it's really compelling, showing that kind of dynamic struggle. And then there's also kind of a magical aspect in here as well that is kind of explored throughout the series. And I think there's no really good way of explaining the series. I think you just need to kind of really immerse yourself in it, and it is really well done. The first book, I will say, is a little bit slow. The first 100 pages are very much setting up this character's background and kind of her kind of eventually coming to age, or the series kind of takes off from there. So don't get a little deterred if you're reading this and you're kind of very much kind of being like, this is like nothing's happening. Like it's honestly, it's well worth kind of seeing that progression, and where we kind of, the main part of the series focuses on her at that point in time. But yeah, if you kind of like Russian history and like the wilderness and just the cold atmospheric reads, then this is a perfect trilogy for you. That's it, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments below what some of your favorite fantasy books are that have some historical element into it and all of that fun stuff. So yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, and I will see you guys next time. Bye, guys.